everyone. It's 4 o'clock in Washington, D.C., where multiple national security crises, all exacerbated by Donald Trump's erratic and untethered foreign policy impulses, await the president and his beleaguered national security team when they return to D.C. after the holidays. The New York Times' David Sanger, with a front-page rebuke of Donald Trump's foreign policy blunders, writes this, quote, President Trump entered the new year facing flare-ups of long-burning crises with two old adversaries, Iran and North Korea, that are directly challenging his claim to have reasserted American power around the world. Trump whipsawed between bellicosity and talk of peace with Iran over the holiday, but he did order the deployment of nearly 700 soldiers from the Army's 82nd Airborne Division to the Middle East. This came after an attack on the U.S. Embassy in Iraq. Washington Post warns of a standoff with Iran there. Quote, Trump now faces a potentially combustible situation where the U.S. and Iran are elbowing for influence in Iraq, as U.S. allies Israel and Saudi Arabia, along with Trump's in-house advisors, urge a more forceful confrontation with Tehran. And on the North Korean front, that nation's rogue leader promising the world a new strategic weapon in the near future, a development Sanger writes is not disconnected from Trump's political weakness. Quote, the timing of these new challenges is critical. Both the Iranians and the North Koreans seem to sense the vulnerability of a president under impeachment and facing re-election. The president's twin global crises are where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. At the table, White House reporter for the LA Times, Eli Stokols, former Democratic Congresswoman Donna Edwards is back, and senior writer for Politico, Jake Sherman, is here. Plus, former Deputy National Security Advisor for President Obama, Ben Rhodes, joins us. Ben, you've been tweeting up a storm on all these crises, but I really want to take them one at a time and flesh out some of your observations and sharp criticisms for our viewers. Let's start with what happened in Iraq and the president's conduct there.
Well, Nicole, I think the important thing here is that the origin of what we're seeing in Iraq is this confrontational approach that he's taken to Iran over the course of the last couple of years. Since pulling out of the Iran nuclear agreement, what we've seen is a steadying ratcheting up of provocations from Iran. They've resumed parts of their nuclear program. They've attacked tankers that go through key shipping lanes in the region. They've obviously shot down a U.S. drone. And now what we see in Iraq is in response to U.S. airstrikes in that country that were not coordinated or even notified to the Iraqi government. What I think the Iranian government did in activating these proxies is send a message to the United States that they can throw their weight around in Iraq, that they can threaten our embassy, that they can essentially try to chase us out of that country. And this is what you get when you have a foreign policy that is not really about anything other than acting on Trump's reckless impulses, undoing pieces of the Obama legacy, and not thinking through what the consequences of the actions are. And now we see those consequences in real time in a very dangerous and unstable situation inside of Iraq.
I want to stay with Iraq, Ben, and it's my observation that his policy toward Iran is the most schizophrenic of all of Trump's ill thought out. But at least in the case of Russia, they're all consistently pro-Putin. In the case of North Korea, he has a delusion that they're beloved pen pals and that there's a peace deal when there isn't. In Iran, he seems truly schizophrenic. There are enough people around him, including his son-in-law, who are arguing for a more confrontational approach. But on New Year's Eve in his tuxedo standing next to Melania, he called for peace with Iran. How does that land in the region?
No, you're exactly right, Nicole, because basically the logic of everything that Trump has actually done is confrontation with Iran. So he's imposed these new sanctions. He's pulled out of the nuclear deal. In doing that, by the way, he alienated all of our allies. So we're all alone in this confrontation with Iran. But whenever he gets right up to the precipice of actually going into a war with Iran, like we saw when he literally turned around U.S. planes that were in the air to strike Iran, he pulls back. He doesn't want to actually have the war that his own policy has been taking us up to the precipice of. And that sends a message to the Iranians that they can get away with anything, that essentially that Trump won't cross certain lines. So the Iranians then know that they can provoke and provoke and provoke, push their influence, expand their influence in places like Iraq, show that the United States is on its back foot, show that the United States is the one that is isolated in the world. And Trump can't do anything to stop that.
I also noticed that this whipsawing is a thread that runs through the deployment of our troops. I was actually surprised to see that he had ordered 750 troops, or nearly 700 troops from the 82nd Airborne, after making such a show. And again, we don't know his motives, but he makes such a show of undermining his own former Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, his former National Security Advisor, John Bolton, in pulling troops, small amounts of troops, out of places where they're actually needed, where they're working alongside people like the Kurds who are keeping us from having to send more. To send troops from the 82nd does certainly send a shockwave through the military families here in this country.
No question. And schizophrenic is the right description of the policy, Nicole, because Donald Trump likes to stand up and say that he's getting us out of these places, that he's pulling the troops out, that he's winding down these wars. But the reality is there are thousands more U.S. troops in the Middle East because Donald Trump has deployed them to Saudi Arabia to provide essentially security for his partner there, Mohammed bin Salman. Now additional troops necessary to secure our embassy in Iraq. So we've seen him do things like pull back. A few hundred U.S. troops are having an enormous impact in Syria in ways that allowed for ISIS fighters to escape and potentially to regenerate. That has certainly led to the killing of some of our Kurdish allies who fought with us. We've seen him announce recently that there are going to be redeployments of U.S. troops in Africa, where very small numbers of U.S. troops are on the front lines trying to keep terrorists and insurgencies from developing. He's pulling back troops where they're not many and they're needed, and then he's pouring thousands of troops to deal with this threat from Iran that he has created by pulling out of the Iran nuclear agreement because, again, he's responding to the impulse from Saudi Arabia, or he's trying to protect our embassy. But again, the reason Saudi Arabia has been more threatened by Iranian provocations and the reason that the Iranians are lashing out inside of Iraq is because of Donald Trump's decision to be more confrontational with Iran. So he's not getting the effects he wanted in terms of changing Iranian behavior. It's getting worse. We're not even focused on the fact that their nuclear program is resumed. And he's trying to have this talking point that he's getting us out of the Middle East, when in fact there are more Americans deployed there than there were when Donald Trump came into office.
A Trump ally warned me never to overthink Trump. How much of his policy in Iran is simply about doing the opposite of that which President Obama, your old boss, did?
Well, that's a big piece of this. There was no logic to pull out of the Iran nuclear agreement. His own Jim Mattis advised against it. His own intelligence community said Iran was complying with that deal. All of our allies in the deal wanted to stay in. I think he wanted to show he was different from Obama. And then he set down this course of being confrontational with Iran, knowing, though, that he never wanted to go all the way into a war with Iran. And so that leads us to this very complicated situation where there's no real logic to what he's doing, but it's making us less safe. It made the diplomats who are serving in Iraq certainly less safe. It has not constrained Iranian influence. It has, in many ways, expanded it, and it has isolated the United States. So Americans should know that we are less safe, less secure. We had a problem that had largely been dealt with in terms of the Iranian nuclear program, at least. That has gone, and we're in this situation where every few months, Nicole, we're on the show talking about some new flashpoint, some new risk of a war between the United States and Iran, and that's where we're going to be so long as Donald Trump is president.